Every year, hundreds of thousands of people sit 10 days of silence to learn a meditation technique called Vipassana. Almost all of them learn it the same way, from a recording of a man named Satya Narayan Goenka, who died in 2013. On the fourth day, in every hall in more than 90 countries, his voice gives them the central instruction, and it tells them where that instruction comes from. Not from Goenka, from the Buddha. Unchanged, carried without a break for 2,500 years, reaching them exactly as it was given. If you have sat a course, you heard that. If you are thinking about sitting one, you will. Either way, it is worth knowing whether it is true. The tape says the same words at the same hour of the same day, whether the hall is in California, or Nepal, or a prison outside Delhi. And the movement is direct about why. Its own history says Goenka decided the recording should be used indefinitely, so that people would keep receiving the teaching as he presented it, without addition or subtraction. Without addition or subtraction. So follow the instruction backwards. Where did it actually come from? And what happened to it on the way? The answer runs through a monk who arrived in Sri Lanka as an outsider. A Chinese translation rarely brought into this argument. A gap of more than 1,000 years. And a lawyer from Texas with a microphone. It starts with one word that ancient Buddhist traditions read two different ways. The instruction you follow on day 4 begins in a text called the Anapanasati Sutta, the Buddha's teaching on mindfulness of breathing, 16 steps. The first 2 are simple. Know when the breath is long, know when it is short. The third step says, train yourself to experience the whole body, breathing in and breathing out. Whole body. In Pāli, kaya. Read it one way and you get exactly what happens in a Goenka course. Attention leaves the breath and moves into the body itself, the face, the shoulders, the arms, down through the torso and the legs, sensation by sensation until nothing is left unexamined. Read it the other way and none of that is there, because kaya can also mean the body of the breath, its whole shape, beginning, middle, end. Under that reading, the third step stays with the breath itself. There is no scan. There never was. 2 readings, 1 sentence. And in the 5th century in Sri Lanka, one of them received an enormous advantage. Buddhaghosa arrived from India as an outsider. The commentaries he wanted were held by the monks of the Mahavihara, and access had to be earned. So he wrote a vast synthesis of the whole path, the Visuddhimagga, built to demonstrate he understood their tradition well enough to be trusted with it. He got the access. His book became the foundation of Theravada for the next 16 centuries. And in it, following the Mahavihara's own reading, the third step means the body of the breath. Other commentarial traditions existed alongside it. They did not survive, which means the reading we inherited is the one that had an institution behind it, which leaves Goenka's method looking like a late invention with an ancient name. Except for one text preserved outside the Pāli tradition that changes the argument. Kumarajiva came from northern India and spent his life turning Indian Buddhist literature into Chinese. He worked with teams of scholar monks on a scale that has few parallels in the ancient world. Around the year 407, shortly before Buddhaghosa reached Sri Lanka, he translated a collection of meditation texts called the Dhyana Samadhi Sutra. It has its own account of the 16 steps. And on the third step, it says awareness pervades the body, inside to the toes and the fingers, out through every pore on the surface, from the feet to the hair. Then it gives an image for how that feel. Water entering sand. The scholar who set that passage beside Goenka's method is Bhikkhu Analayo, a Theravada monastic who works comparatively across the early texts. His finding, the Chinese account and the Uba Kin tradition sit closely together, and both stand apart from Buddhaghosa. The correspondence goes further than the general idea. Goenka's tradition describes an advanced stage it calls free flow, where awareness passes through the entire body inside a single breath, downward on the out-breath, upward on the in-breath. Now hold the old simile against that. The grains of sand are the smallest sensations. The water is awareness moving through them, and when water enters sand, every grain is wetted. An instruction written in India, preserved in Chinese, describing something a Burmese civil servant would teach an Indian businessman 1600 years later. Analayo stays cautious about how far that goes. The roots, he writes, appear to reach back around 2,000 years. In later work, he adds the limit. The systematic scan as a distinct procedure was presumably unknown in the earliest Buddhism, and grew out of mindfulness of breathing. And the dates settle less than they seem to. Neither text tells us which reading came first. What they tell us is that both existed. And then it goes quiet. The Chinese text survives. The body-oriented reading it preserves leaves no documented route forward, not for a century, not for 5, not for more than 1,000 years. Whatever happened between the fall of Buddhist India and the 19th century, the record does not hold it. Then in Burma, under the British, a strikingly related method enters the visible record. What happens next is a relay, and we told it in full in the Vipassana episode. So here it is, by what each man changed. Ledi Sayadaw takes it out of the monastery, a scholar monk in colonial Burma, watching the traditional institutions lose their protection. He starts teaching meditation to farmers and clerks, people with no intention of ordaining and no expectation of ever being taught. Before Ledi, serious meditation belonged overwhelmingly to monastic specialists. After him, systematic insight practice becomes something an ordinary layperson can expect to be taught. Saya Thetki steps outside the robe entirely, a layman teaching laypeople, with no ordination standing behind him. Uba Khin brings it into the office, Accountant General of newly independent Burma, running courses for civil servants and foreigners between working days. Goenka takes it out of Burma, 14 years under Uba Khin, then India in 1969, and 14 students in his first course. Notice what every one of them still required: a living teacher in the room, someone who could explain, emphasize, answer a question, and respond to the particular person in front of them. That flexibility is what keeps a transmission alive. It is also what lets it drift, because no two teachers do it identically, and nobody can audit what was said in a room 50 years ago. Goenka was about to reduce that variation at the center of the course more radically than this lineage had done before. But before he could fix the instruction in place, he had to decide what the instruction included. He kept the classical sequence: Sila, Samadhi, Panya, moral conduct, concentration, wisdom. He kept sensation as the field where insight happens. And he set aside monastic membership, ritual obligation, conversion, and any requirement to have studied the texts before you arrive. He never called that simplification. In August 2000, speaking at the United Nations to 2,000 religious leaders, he made the larger claim. Every religion, he said, has an outer shell of rites and doctrines and an inner core that is the same everywhere. Then he told the room that what India calls Dharma has nothing to do with any of the great traditions, and he named 7 of them. Buddhism was on the list, which is the claim underneath everything else. In Goenka's account, Dhamma was the universal core itself, and the sectarian labels came afterwards. March 1982, Bodh Gaya at the Burmese Vihara, where Goenka himself had spent much of his time a decade before. Bill Hart is about to conduct the first 10-day course ever led by anyone other than Goenka. He was handed the job with under a month's notice because nobody else was free. In his luggage are the tapes carrying Goenka's voice. Day 1. After the evening discourse, the students come back into the hall for the last sitting. Hart reaches over and presses play. A faint hiss comes out of the speakers. This is the movement's own account of what happened next, and it is worth hearing. The tape has failed, so Hart gives the instructions himself, which is exactly what Goenka had told the assistant teachers to do if the equipment let them down. And he keeps giving them every evening for the rest of the course. The tapes he was carrying did not include the evening instructions at all. For 10 days, the older form of transmission comes back, a man in a room saying it in his own voice. It is a glimpse of the system before complete recordings made that improvisation unnecessary. Because the recordings barely existed. A few had been made since the early 70s by students with little technical experience, patched together from different courses, full of gaps and repetitions. Nobody had ever tried to capture a whole 10-day course from beginning to end. Later that year, an American named Thomas Chrisman proposed doing it. He had been a lawyer in Texas until a course in Chicago changed his direction. Goenka hesitated. He worried the equipment would disturb the meditators. Chrisman promised to be like a little mouse. One of the most widely reproduced meditation courses in the world came close to never being recorded at all. From 1982 to 1986, Chrisman taped the English courses in America each summer and traveled to India each winter for the Hindi-English ones. Equipment proved faulty. Microphones sat badly. The power at Dhammagiri cut out and had to be run off a wall of car batteries. Once, rain on a tent roof forced Goenka to shout over it. Every time a course was taped again, the whole process started over and a new edition was made. Only with the 6th was Chrisman satisfied. 42 cassettes held the audio from a single course. Those English and Hindi-English recordings remain the basis of courses today, alongside the translated versions used around the world. Buddhaghosa's reading became normative through the survival and authority of a written tradition. Nobody planned that. It is what happened. Goenka's reading became permanent through recording technology. That was designed. The design worked, and it worked at a scale this lineage had never reached before. In 1972, Goenka met Vinoba Bhave, a spiritual successor of Gandhi, who challenged him to teach 2 groups almost nobody teaches: children and criminals. 3 years later, Jaipur Central Jail in Rajasthan held the first 10-day course inside a prison. Tihar came 18 years after that, and Tihar changed the scale. November 1993, inside Delhi's Tihar prison. 96 inmates and 23 jail staff sat the first course together. A second followed in January for 300. Then in April 1994, Goenka led a course for 1,000 inmates, and afterwards opened Dhamma Tihar, the first Vipassana center established inside a prison anywhere in the world. His first course in India, 25 years earlier, had 14 students. The recordings are what let that scale keep the same course everywhere. Most founder-led movements hit the same wall. The founder dies, the heirs contest the inheritance. The teaching splits into factions, each claiming the true version. Goenka designed around it. He raised no single spiritual heir. He trained assistant teachers in large numbers and spread authority among them. And he fixed the core instruction in recordings so it would not depend on any of them. The design left no throne standing empty. Most movements reproduce the teacher. Goenka reproduced the course. He died in September 2013 at 89, and the architecture of a 10-day course barely changed. Of the movement's 270 permanent centers, more than 200 are in Asia. India alone holds close to half the world's total. The Western picture of this movement is a Silicon Valley waiting list. In 2018, the chief executive of Twitter sat a course and told 4 million followers it was a way to hack the deepest layer of the mind. He wore an Apple Watch and a sleep tracking ring for all 10 days, and afterwards described some sittings as better than others. That story is real, and it describes the western edge of something whose center of gravity is overwhelmingly Asian. It also shows what the design cannot reach. The course could train him in equanimity. It could not decide the language he would use to explain it afterwards. One standard course offered everywhere. The people who walk into it are never standard. The recording gives every person in that hall the same instruction. The teachers around it have to recognize when the same instruction is no longer enough. Many of you watching have finished one of these courses and describe it as among the most valuable things you have done. That belongs in the record. So does the experience of the smaller number for whom it ended very differently. In January 2023, the Financial Times Special Investigations editor Madison Marriage received an email from a worried father about his daughters and a network of meditation retreats. 12 months of reporting followed, published in early 2024. The reporting collected accounts from participants describing severe insomnia, paranoia, hallucinations, and breaks with reality during and after courses. The series also examined 2 deaths by suicide involving former participants and investigated whether retreat experiences had contributed to what happened to them. We are not naming them or reconstructing their circumstances. They were private people, and their families did not choose this. The Financial Times reported that these risks were not disclosed to applicants at sign-up, and that staff were not trained to respond when someone deteriorated. Representatives of the network responded. They described screening applicants before acceptance, guidance given to teachers on mental health, procedures allowing a teacher to take someone out of a course, or to contact relatives and medical professionals. Some disputed the link the reporting drew between meditation and later crises. What the network tells applicants now sits in its code of discipline. Old symptoms may resurface during or after a course. Conditions in remission may return. Vipassana is not a substitute for psychiatric care, and the course is not recommended for people with significant mental health difficulties. Here is what the research supports and where it stops. Adverse effects are documented. A 2020 review examined 83 studies covering more than 6,000 participants and found around 8% reported a negative effect from meditation. The reviewers described that as similar to the percentage reported in studies of psychological therapies, with anxiety and depression most common. That review spans many practices at many intensities, so it cannot serve as a risk rate for a Goenka retreat. And the United States National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health adds the honest caveat. Too few studies have examined meditation for harm to say anything definite about its safety. Widespread benefit does not answer a severe case. A severe case does not prove the practice caused every crisis that followed it. But look at where the structure runs out. Clinical systems draw an explicit line between the standard protocol and individual judgment. Protocols handle the recurring problem, and they save enormous numbers of lives precisely because they do not vary between practitioners. Crisis care begins where the standard case ends, and the harder gap opens after day 10. A center can act while someone is still on site. Some crises surface later or continue after a participant has gone home, when the 10-day structure no longer guarantees any contact at all. Informed consent for something this intense should not promise that every difficult experience is progress. It should describe the intensity honestly, name the known adverse reactions, and make clear that screening cannot predict every crisis. It should say what support exists during the course and after it. And it should establish that asking for help or leaving for safety is not a spiritual failure. Exact instruction can standardize a practice. It cannot be the whole response to a person in trouble. So did Goenka teach the Buddha's Vipassana or his own? The instruction is genuinely ancient. Breath practice, bodily awareness, feeling tone, the contemplation of impermanence, all of it canonical, none of it invented in the 20th century. The specific reading behind the body scan is ancient too. A Chinese translation from the early 5th century preserves something strikingly close to what Goenka taught in an image about water entering sand. The unbroken chain from the Buddha is a matter of tradition rather than record. The movement affirms it. The documentation does not, and the visible trail begins in colonial Burma. And the 10-day course that carries all of it is unmistakably modern, and unmistakably his. One distinction matters here because it is the question most people actually have. If you sat those 10 days and came out steadier than you went in, none of this takes that away. A gap in the historical record cannot reverse an experience you had. And Goenka asked students to test the method for themselves. That was always part of how he taught it. But the movement makes a second claim alongside the practical one, that this is the Buddha's original technique, preserved without addition or subtraction. That claim does more than describe the past. It explains why the movement treats this particular course as complete, why other practices must be set aside for the duration, and why its core instruction is not supposed to change. The method can stand or fall on what practitioners experience. The claim of unchanged transmission has to stand on evidence, and the evidence does not carry it all the way back. The practice is older than his critics allow, and younger than he claimed. Across 2,000 years, the record preserves fragments rather than a root. One reading became normative in Theravada. Another survived in Chinese. Then the trail breaks, and when a closely related method appears again in Burma, it is once more traveling the old way, through living teachers, one room at a time. Whether or not Goenka ever framed the history in those terms, his recording system answered the same problem. It protected his version from the variation, the omission, and the institutional drift that reach any long transmission. The recording is what that decision looks like. It repeats the same answer with remarkable consistency across a worldwide network, for as long as anyone keeps pressing play. It cannot answer a new question. That was never a flaw somebody failed to fix. It is the trade that carried this out of one country and around the world, and the reason it reached as many people as it has. More than 40 years ago in a hall at Bodh Gaya, a tape failed and a man had to speak for himself. That problem was always solvable. The harder one is different. A broken tape can be replaced by a living teacher. Whether a living teacher may change what the tape says, and through what process, remains unclear from outside the movement. The tape cannot answer it either. It was recorded before the question existed. Long after everyone who knew Goenka personally is gone, that voice may still be giving the same instruction. So here is the argument worth having. Does fixing a teaching protect it, or does it eventually freeze a living tradition in place? And when something needs to change, who has the standing to change it? Whether you completed the course, walked out early, or have only heard about it, the comments on this one should be worth reading. For the history behind this investigation, watch our Vipassana episode next. For the concentration debate, the jhanas episode is linked on screen. Subscribe for more investigations into how Buddhism changed as it crossed cultures, languages, and centuries. Stay curious. Stay wise.